Welcome back to day 2 of Symposium, Past, Present and Future of Human Rights. As those of you who met us yesterday already knows, my name is Johan Söderberg, and the three of us are organizing this symposium. Today we have 3 planks on the agenda. First of all, we will have a presentation by Jessica Whyte. I will come back to the presentation in shortly. And afterwards there will be 2 concluding discussions with the panelists. And here we have a change from the schedule as it was announced previously. So Milbank has graciously accepted to be in both of our panels, and we're really happy about that. While Igor Shoikhedbrod will now be in the second panel in the afternoon due to time zone differences. But other than that, we will proceed as we have said before. Now, for the first plank. Jessica is Associate Professor in the School of Humanities and Languages at University of New South Wales, Australia. Her work as a political theorist integrates political philosophy, intellectual history, and political economy. Previously, she has published a book about, and several other works on Giorgio Agamben, the book Catastrophe and Redemption from 2013. We would like to highlight an article in addition to that on the Haitian Revolution and human rights on the basis of Agamben's thought. Whyte has also edited a volume on the misreadings of Karl Marx written by writers in the French theory tradition, and among others where Michel Foucault is figured, and from there on we guess there could be some connections to the topics being discussed today as well. Human rights, which is the topic of this panel, however, is the direct issue at discussion in her latest book, and much appreciated and discussed, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, which was published in 2019. And with that, sorry. Afterwards, Elena Namli will be invited. We invite you to give comments on Jessica's presentation. So with that, please, Jessica, I give the word to you. And you're muted.
Yes. Thank you. I want to start by thanking all the organisers. It's a real pleasure to be here, even if here is virtual, not in person, as was originally discussed long ago. So as I'm not there, instead, I'm speaking here from Sydney, Australia, from the unceded land of the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. And my paper is on critiques of human rights. In 2017, the human rights scholar Philip Alston argued that academic critics of human rights need to consider the unintended consequences of their critiques and be wary of spreading pessimism amongst human rights advocates. Alston, who was until 2020 the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, contended that critics concentrated in elite universities in the West disillusion students while contributing little to present challenges. In what he presented as extraordinarily dangerous times, Alston bemoaned the existence of what he termed unenlightening dead-end scholarship, which leads only to despair. Although he framed the dangers of the present as unprecedented, Alston's remedy was familiar. I quote, "We cannot wait. We need to start acting. We need to do whatever we can to strengthen respect for international human rights." Alston's article is only one instance of a new genre of human rights scholarship that we could call the critique of rights. Faced with the rise of anti-liberal politics, authoritarian regimes, and worldwide repression of NGOs, human rights scholars have taken the offensive, aiming their fire at a supposedly irresponsible deluge of critique. But Alston's challenge raises a number of questions. Why is respect for human rights currently weak internationally? Why have decades of human rights campaigns been unable to forestall the rise of what Alston describes as nationalistic, xenophobic, misogynistic populism that is antagonistic to the very idea of human rights? And why are defenders of human rights so susceptible to despair in the face of critique? The US political scientist Catherine Sickink has an answer to this final question. In Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, she challenges what she calls the recent increase of pessimism about human rights by providing what she suggests is evidence for hope. Human rights law, institutions and movements have been much more effective than people think, Sickink argues, and the view that human rights violations are rising is simply false. But if that's so, she asks, why do many people believe the opposite? The short answer, she responds, is that we think the world is worse off because we care more and know more about human rights than ever before. While we are literally awash in human rights critiques, in her words, she argues that much academic criticism and pessimism is unfounded and offers little to improving the world or even improving human rights. Now, these scholars are right to note the proliferation of critiques that characterize human rights as ineffective, indeterminate, or anti-democratic. From the left, critics contend that human rights discourses are the moral complement to neoliberal capitalism, that they sanctify private property, atomized individuals, and free markets, and that the international human rights regime is powerless to respond to spiraling economic inequality. Anti-colonial critics highlight the birth defect of the international human rights movement, its lack of global representativity, and the resemblance of human rights campaigns to older colonial civilizing missions. Critics also highlight the anti-political valence of much human rights activism and note that the seemingly minimalist focus on preventing human suffering is not immune from licensing violence and entrenching domination. At the sharpest end, as human rights became a new currency for intervention, critics warned that the human rights movement may be furbishing the tools of the military. The critique of human rights, however, no longer comes, if it ever did, exclusively from the left. From the right, critics charge human rights with fostering narcissism, self-interest, social breakdown, and the dissolution of traditional families, with protecting terrorists and criminals, and with threatening natural hierarchies and private power. Authoritarian leaders push back against the naming and shaming techniques of transnational human rights NGOs, and Vladimir Putin's suggestion that the liberal idea has become obsolete is echoed across the globe by repressive heads of state who loudly affirm their national sovereignty. The blunt statement of Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte, "I don't care about human rights, you better believe me," is only the starkest sign that many politicians on the right are increasingly unwilling to pay lip service to human rights. Diagnoses of a crisis of human rights emerge alongside the rise of new actors, notably China, and in a multipolar world in which states and NGOs in the global north, notably the United States, have less control than previously over the creation and implementation of human rights standards. Just as the language of human rights is polyvalent, capable of being mobilized for diverse political ends, critiques of human rights have shifted along with their objects of critique. Just as Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France, which has justly been described as the primal scene for critiques of human rights, was published within a year of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the 20th century attempt to develop an international bill of human rights was immediately met by critical responses to what many viewed as an anachronistic attempt to rejuvenate a superseded tradition of natural law. While these earlier critics rarely targeted human rights per se, choosing instead to struggle over the relative weight given to different rights, the volume of contemporary critique and the apocalyptic predictions have been fostered by a perception that human rights have since become the name for a determinate vision of politics. The more human rights has monopolised political discourse, I suggest, the more alternative political positions have been framed as critiques of human rights. Now, each of these critiques of human rights has its own tangled history. In this paper, I want to focus in particular on the development of two overlapping critiques. First, I consider the argument that far from empowering political agency, human rights discourses are premised on a fatalistic resignation in the absence of larger agendas for social and political transformation. For diverse critics, human rights are at best the consolation prize for those who have lost hope in grander political utopias, and at worst, an anti-political entrenchment of existing social and economic realities. I then examine the related argument that rights broadly and human rights specifically are the moral complement to the global imposition of capitalist market relations. This critique, inspired by Karl Marx's 19th century critique of the rights of man, has intensified in the post-Cold War period as triumphant capitalism rose alongside a transnational human rights movement. What both criticisms share is the belief that human rights is less a language of radical opposition than one of submission to the status quo. As human rights advocates contend that critics of human rights on the left are corrupting the youth even as the world burns, in Sam Moyn's ironic words, this paper tries to disentangle left and right critiques of human rights. It contests the claim, made most stridently by the NYU legal scholar Grana de Burka, that one-sided critiques that blame human rights for the results of neoliberalism, in her words, provide ammunition to strengthen the chorus of conservative and other voices denigrating the human rights project. As with the use of the term populism to describe everything from the mild social democracy of former British Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn to the far-right militaristic regime of Jair Bolsonaro, such criticisms presuppose that what matters most is not the differences between rival political positions on the left and the right, but their shared distance from previously hegemonic liberal positions. Undoubtedly, recent developments have scrambled easy dichotomies between left and right. Nonetheless, this paper highlights the significant divergences between critiques of human rights from the left and from the right. I argue that there remains a fundamental divide between those who criticise human rights for interfering with economic inequalities and hierarchies of race and gender, and those who criticise human rights NGOs for insulating the inequalities of civil society from political challenge. Only those who have forgotten about a politics marked by rival conceptions of the good could see these critiques as mutually reinforcing. So first, to turn to the question of liberal millenarianism and what Sam Moyn has called the last utopia. In Arguments for Hope, Sikkink criticises scholars who critique human rights without proposing alternatives drawn from what she terms the realm of the possible. She approvingly cites the Brazilian legal scholar and human rights advocate Paulo Sergio Pinheiro's remark that there is no other language, no other set of principles that allow, given our universal diversity, the respect for a few fundamental standards for human beings to live with dignity and respect. Yet, in assuming that possible alternatives must look very much like human rights, a few fundamental standards for human rights to live with dignity and respect, this statement obscures other visions of the good and evades the question of whether fundamental standards actually secure either human dignity or respect. The possible alternatives that would be acceptable on these terms are, it turns out, not really alternatives at all. In reality, the borders of the realm of the possible are neither pre-given nor stable. At one level, Sikkink realises this when she attributes her own method to Albert Hirschman's account of possibilism, which he explained as an attempt to navigate between a realistic orientation to incremental change and a utopian embrace of proposals that require total political transformation. Hirschman understood his own possibilism as a persistent attempt to expand the limits of the possible. Taking her own social mobility as evidence of such expansion, Sikik contends that this is exactly what the human rights movement has done repeatedly. But for many critics, and even for many human rights advocates, mainstream human rights organisations have contributed not to expanding the limits of the possible, but in fact to contracting them. Pressed about the relative weight of domestic law and international human rights law in 2020, Kenneth Roth, Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, disparaged popular sovereignty and insisted, and this is a quote, that the whole point of the human rights system is to restrict options available to governments. Around the beginning of the new millennium, critical voices began to ask whether, in the wake of the end of history, human rights were contributing to a closure of the political imagination that rendered emancipatory political possibilities more faint. When Michael Ignatieff declared in 2000 that the global diffusion of human rights was evidence of moral progress, defined as a reduction in the amount of unmerited cruelty and suffering in the world, many critics greeted this as a rather disappointing utopia, particularly in contrast to aspirations towards global material equality, national self-determination, and collective solidarity that animated other 20th century political movements. Ignatieff, however, contended that what he depicted as his minimalism was not merely pragmatic. Rather, after a century of violence and slaughter, justified as a means to grant political ends, he insisted that this was the most we could hope for. Whether human rights were able to stick to this purported minimalism was another story, or another question. In his revisionist history of human rights, as many would be familiar, Sam Moyn argued that human rights became prominent from the 70s onwards because they offered a moral alternative to failed political utopias, notably communism and anti-colonialism. In the wake of the gulags and the authoritarian turn of many post-colonial states, human rights appeared, in Moyn's words, as the god that did not fail while other political ideologies did. And yet the very absence of alternatives compromised the anti-political purity that had made human rights so attractive in the first place, Moyn argued, and human rights were burdened with the maximalism that they had come to prominence precisely by avoiding. By the 1990s, he suggested, human rights had taken on a literally millennial appeal in Western public discourse. But at this point, in a new twist on the dialectic of enlightenment, it appeared that in order to prevent cruelty and suffering, human rights discourses may have to rationalize an amount of cruelty and suffering of their own. The liberal critique of the tyranny of the good comes at a price, Slavoj Žižek warned in 2008. As it permeates society, it turns into its opposite, as the modern rejection of utopias ends with imposing its own market liberal utopia of free markets and human rights mechanisms. Human rights now became the language that proved the superiority of liberalism and capitalism, marked the arrival of the end of history, and legitimized what to some looked disturbingly like the older colonial civilizing missions. Human rights, which was supposed to set out only the conditions for the good life, as Frederick Megre puts it, actually became equated with the good life. So, is another world possible? It was only when human rights came to signify a distinct political project bound to the global projection of US power and liberal capitalism that critiques of human rights began in earnest. Many critics now sought new names to signify the object of their critique. Upendra Bakshi distinguished between modern human rights and contemporary human rights. Robert Meister traced a shift from revolutionary human rights to counter-revolutionary human rights discourse. Kostas Douzinas contrasted human rights as institutional practice with human rights as principle of popular politics. Mikhail Matua argued that the Cold War birth of the modern human rights movement had distorted the true identity and raison d'etre of the human rights corpus. And Moyn insisted on the rupture between the revolutionary rights of man and the human rights of the late 70s. Not willing to give up entirely on the language of human rights, these critics nonetheless discerned that the ideology currently expressed in that name was a distinctive one that reflected the liberal capitalist hegemony of the post-Cold War period. As human rights began to appear as a distinct and hegemonic idea, capable of licensing interventions across borders, critics began to explicitly question the wisdom of expressing our highest aspirations in the language of human rights. Even as they questioned the claims made by human rights advocates to transcend politics, however, these critics also posed the question, put most clearly by the North American political theorist Wendy Brown in a powerful response to Ignatieff, of whether a moral politics of human rights focused on the alleviation of human suffering is really the most we can hope for. Brown's essay of that name was published in the South Atlantic Quarterly in 2004, in the midst of the war in Iraq, which Ignatieff had by then described as a human rights campaign. Brown pointed out that Ignatieff was unable to remain within the bounds of his purported minimalism. Instead, she contended, he proposed a substantive politics that sanctioned capitalism and free markets, and he offered a distinctive theory of change, according to which human rights not only prevent the worst cruelty, but also foster agency and the capacity of collectives to act together to shape their own societies. While Ignatieff framed his own prioritization of civil and political rights over what he called collective rights as a concern, in his words, with what is strictly necessary to the enjoyment of any life whatsoever, Brown argued that in reality, he offered not an ontological account of what human beings need to enjoy life, but rather a political economic account of what markets need to thrive. How else to explain, she asked, why Ignatieff did not include a right to food among those rights necessary to any life whatsoever. Brown's broader point was that despite the protestations of Ignatieff and others like him, there was no such thing as a mere reduction of suffering or prevention of cruelty. Human rights never simply protect and liberate, she argued. They also regulate and even dominate. Although these new millennia critics of human rights all sought to challenge a pervasive closure of the political imagination, they did so in a context in which political alternatives no longer had names and could not be defended on their own terms. Brown gestured towards other possibilities that human rights may cause to recede, but she left unspecified what those possibilities may be. Moyn suggested that human rights may have been born as the last utopia, but in his words, one day another one may appear. But this was more a programmatic statement of resistance to historical closure than advocacy for any definitive utopian alternative. Robert Meister argued that the new human rights universalism of the post-Cold War period was the self-consciousness of US capitalist hegemony. But he left open the question of whether or not the entire modern revolutionary tradition had been co-opted by this hegemony. Matua argued that human rights norms have become a blunt instrument in the hands of imperial states, but he portrayed calls to abandon human rights as, in his words, an abdication by some of us who are comfortable in our personal and professional lives and who seek to paralyze ourselves intellectually so that we have a rational excuse for doing nothing. And in the midst of his powerful critique of trade-related, market-friendly human rights, Bakshi tentatively suggested that human rights languages, however effete, remain perhaps all that we have to interrogate the barbarism of power. These critiques were simultaneously rejections of the post-Cold War closure of the political imagination and symptoms of it. This dynamic of disillusion and disorientation is at the root of what Ben Golder has astutely described as redemptive critiques of rights, in which human rights are sharply criticised only to ultimately be salvaged. Here, the contention that another human right is possible, or another human rights is possible, was the flip side of the belief that there is no alternative to human rights. Now, while earlier critiques of human rights came largely from outside the established human rights organisations and fora, in the wake of the global financial crisis of 2007, as public attention turned to economic inequality and the social costs of decades of neoliberal reform, critical voices began to be raised from within the human rights mainstream. In 2015, Philip Alston himself argued that extreme economic inequality should be a cause of shame on the part of the international human rights movement, and he criticised major NGOs, including Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, for their reluctance to address questions of distribution and their indifference to the deep structures that perpetuate inequalities. The second decade of the 21st century saw critics of human rights increasingly focus on the marginalisation of social and economic rights and debate the relationship between the rise of human rights in Anglo-American and European societies since the 70s and the increasing hegemony of neoliberalism in the same period. In his powerful 2018 book on the changing relationship between egalitarianism and social and economic rights, Moyn argued that attempts to achieve equality were gradually displaced by the consolation prize of sufficiency, detaching campaigns for social and economic rights from any broader commitment to egalitarian economic relations, and making human rights unthreatening in a neoliberal age in which economic inequality within countries has spiraled. And we heard more about these sufficiency arguments from Lena yesterday. Throughout the 20th century, social and economic rights were never uncontroversial. While Moyn depicts the Universal Declaration as a program for national welfare states, the British Labour Party, which built the post-war welfare state at home, sent its delegate to the United Nations with strict instructions to ensure that the new international rights document contained no social and economic rights. Domestic welfare was one thing, its universalisation in a world of colonial empires was another. During the drafting of the Universal Declaration, the most fervent opponent of social and economic rights was the Lebanese delegate Charles Malik, who argued, I quote, that the government controls that would be needed to realise these rights would mean the destruction of free institutions in a free world. Although Malik drew on Christian theology more than liberal philosophy, his critique of social and economic rights would resonate with those of many liberals in the subsequent decades, who argued that a small, respectable core of rights dedicated to securing individual freedom had been muddled by the addition of social and economic claims. A particularly forceful version of this critique by the liberal philosopher Maurice Cranston was published in 1967, the year after the adoption of the Human Rights Covenants. Defining human rights as a form of moral rights that are held by all people in all circumstances at all times, Cranston rejected the conflation of human rights with what he argued was a logically distinct category of rights that relied on economic resources and could not possibly be granted to all the world's people. Singling out the Universal Declaration's right to holidays with pay, as so many subsequent critics of social and economic rights would do, Cranston argued that such a right failed the test of practicality. If it is impossible for a thing to be done, it is absurd to claim it as a right, he wrote. For the foreseeable future, he contended, a lack of resources made it quite impossible that the people of Africa, Asia, and much of the rest of the world could be granted such a right. The neoliberal philosopher Friedrich Hayek took this critique further. Such supposed rights were simply meaningless, he contended, as no declaration of rights could bring them into being. The conception of a universal right, which assures to the peasant, to the Eskimo, and presumably to the abominable snowman, periodic holidays with pay, Hayek wrote, shows the absurdity of the whole thing. Nonetheless, as I've argued at length in my book, The Morals of the Market, Human Rights and the Rise of Neoliberalism, neither Hayek nor his neoliberal colleagues dispensed with human rights. On the contrary, they argued that properly understood and disentangled from so-called social and economic rights, human rights could secure the private domains of individuals from the predations of the interventionist state. Speaking of social and economic rights, Hayek wrote, debases the word right, the strict meaning of which it is very important to preserve if we are to maintain a free society. From 1947, when Hayek founded the Montpellier Society to rejuvenate international liberalism, organised neoliberals drew on the language of human rights to protect private property and investment, to legitimise interventions into the now sovereign territories of former colonies, and to promote an international moral order conducive to competitive market relations. The critique of social and economic rights made by a neoliberal like Hayek was not a fringe position. It was echoed by many in mainstream human rights NGOs. As late as 2006, Arian Nair, the former head of Human Rights Watch, argued, and I quote, "Not everybody can have everything, and the role of human rights is to specify those few things to which everyone is entitled." My own work has suggested that human rights NGOs were not simply unthreatening to the neoliberal project, as Moyn has argued. They were at times actively complicit with it, and at others they accepted large aspects of the neoliberal intellectual armature, albeit at times unwittingly. Yet human rights is not an unchanging discourse, and in the early days of the new millennium, mainstream human rights organisations began to adapt in the face of critique. In 2011, the legal scholar Susan Marks drew attention to a new emphasis on the root causes of human rights violations in the course of the previous decade. Marks noted that UN special rapporteurs increasingly highlighted the relationship between poverty, inequality, and the abuse of human rights, though only sporadically in the case of those with mandates oriented to civil and political rights. To Marks's examples, we could add that of Amnesty International, which changed its mandate in 2001 to allow it to work on social, economic, and cultural rights, and went further under the subsequent presidency of Irene Khan, whose foreword to the NGO's 2009 report condemned our two-tier world of deprivation and gluttony. Recognising that economic, social, and cultural rights were marginalised from large parts of the 20th century, that's a quote from Amnesty International, Amnesty's recent advocacy has concerned questions as diverse as the denial of maternal health care in the United States, forced evictions in Zimbabwe, and the plight of migrant workers in Qatar. In however limited a way, the earlier antipathy towards social and economic rights among mainstream human rights NGOs has been largely superseded, as these NGOs have taken on the cause of the impoverished alongside that of the tortured and the disappeared. This new attention to poverty, inequality, and root causes, as Susan Marks noted, has often been superficial, stopping the search for causation too soon, identifying effects as causes, and identifying causes only to set them aside. Amnesty's recent transformation reveals the way in which critical positions have been both absorbed and sanitised by the official human rights architecture. Amnesty credits the World Social Forum movement, which emerged in the wake of massive protest against structural adjustment across the Global South and against the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle, for shifting attention towards poverty, inequality, and the denial of social and economic rights. Yet its own translation of this movement is devoid of the contention that the other worlds that are possible may be non-capitalist ones. The Amnesty report that cites the influence of the World Social Forum does not even reject the privatisation of basic resources, calling instead to, I quote, ensure that privatisation does not negatively affect access to services such as water, healthcare, and education. While the report recognises that certain provisions of trade agreements clearly safeguard the interests of wealthy states and multinational corporations at the expense of people in developing countries, that's a quote, it also asserts, and I quote, that trade liberalisation can bring positive benefits, and it stops far short of criticising the global economic system. But as minimalist as challenges to the existing economic order were, they were nonetheless enough to provoke a right-wing backlash. So now I want to turn to critiquing human rights on the right. In 2019, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo announced the launch of a new Commission on Unalienable Rights to be chaired by the human rights scholar and former US Ambassador to the Vatican, Mary Ann Glendon. Writing in the Wall Street Journal, Pompeo argued that human rights advocacy has lost its bearings and become more of an industry than a moral compass. While critiques of the declining moral authority of the global human rights regime have become common on the left, Pompeo saw the cause of the corruption of human rights in recent attempts to create what he called new categories of rights that blur the boundaries between unalienable rights and rights granted by governments. Not everything good or everything granted by government can be a universal right, Pompeo argued. Singling out collective economic rights, the Secretary of State warned loose talk of rights unmoors us from the principles of liberal democracy. Much of this language was reiterated in the report released by the Commission on Unalienable Rights in mid-2020, which opened by declaring that the ambitious human rights project of the past century is in crisis. The report's introduction singled out China for denying the compatibility of civil and political liberties with economic and social measures, but it also noted that even some liberal democracies were losing sight of what it termed the urgency of human rights. Now, coming from an administration that had been so willing to violate and disparage human rights and openly support those who abused them overseas, such concern seemed surprising. Prior to Pompeo's efforts, the Trump administration had seemed to dispense with the human rights rhetoric of previous US administrations in favor of a blunt America First agenda. In its 2017 World Report, Human Rights Watch criticized both Trump's election campaign, as in its words, marked by misogynistic, xenophobic, and racist rhetoric, and Trump's embrace of policies that it wrote would cause tremendous harm to vulnerable communities, contravene the United States' core human rights obligations, or both. By 2019, however, as the icicles of a new Cold War began to crystallize, the US administration appeared to recognize the utility of human rights in challenging China and Iran. But utilizing human rights would also require re-signifying them to wind back the victories of those who had struggled to have social and economic rights, as well as the rights of migrants, women, and sexual minorities included on the human rights agenda. Just as left-wing criticisms of human rights left their mark on the priorities of the mainstream human rights movement, Pompeo's commission drew on critiques of human rights from the right in order to transform the discourse of human rights. Attitudes to human rights on the new far right are not uniform, and some right-wing parties have sought to draw on the symbolic capital of human rights in contesting their enemies, even as they endorse policies that violate numerous established rights. Trump's former chief strategist, Steve Bannon, has stressed the importance of American leadership to defend China's citizens, who he argues live in a totalitarian regime under which, I quote, they don't have any rights and they don't own private property. In the wake of the 2015 Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, the leader of the French far right, Marine Le Pen, wrote that France, land of human rights and freedoms, was attacked on its own soil by a totalitarian ideology, Islamic fundamentalism. And the right-wing youth movement, Generation Identity, has strategically mobilized human rights discourse and borrowed tactics and symbolism from human rights NGOs to project itself into the mainstream while redefining rights in exclusivist, nativist terms. These characterizations of human rights as a legacy of Western civilization to be mobilized against a series of enemies that includes China, Muslims, and immigrants at large is undoubtedly at odds with the dominant stances of many human rights advocates today. But it's nonetheless not an aberration in the history of human rights, which has been replete with such civilizing narratives. On the other hand, in the second decade of the 21st century, significant currents on the right, including those in elected office, have turned against human rights and mobilized their constituencies against the name and shame tactics of human rights NGOs. And it's worth noting that this is something that even, for instance, General Pinochet in Chile and that sort of generation of authoritarian leaders rarely did. In 2017, then British Prime Minister Theresa May said that if human rights laws stop the government from restricting the freedom of terrorist suspects, in her words, we will change the laws so we can do it. May followed the tune played by the leader of the right-wing United Kingdom Independence Party, Nigel Farage, who had long argued that the Human Rights Act was an umbrella, this is a quote, an umbrella protecting foreign terrorists and criminal suspects. Russian President Vladimir Putin empowered the Justice Ministry to declare human rights NGOs as foreign agents, and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu supported legislation to crack down on NGOs that had received foreign funding, while describing the Israeli human rights NGO B'Tselem, which documents human rights abuses in the occupied Palestinian territories, as a disgrace. Many of these figures reject the globalism that early neoliberalism shared with the mainstream human rights movement. For several decades, major human rights NGOs have worked to challenge affirmations of sovereignty and to argue that violations of human rights provide a rationale for interventions in the territories of sovereign states. By the beginning of 2017, however, Kenneth Roth of Human Rights Watch was warning that, in his words, claims of unfettered majoritarianism were the greatest danger today to the future of Western democracy, and they threatened to reverse the accomplishments of the modern human rights movement. That same year, an article in Foreign Policy argued that we had entered an era of resurgent sovereignty, which was ushering in a post-human rights world. The recent backlash against international human rights has often been cast as a defence of national sovereignty and has taken particularly virulent forms in opposition to the rights of migrants and asylum seekers. While Trump's claim in his inauguration speech that it is the right of all nations to put their own interests first signalled that the United States was no longer the human rights regime's self-appointed global cop, the rise of explicit defences of sovereignty was not confined to the USA. From Turkey to China to Russia to Israel to the United Kingdom, leaders have railed against international human rights advocates and argued for the priority of national sovereignty over supranational norms. Although it has earlier precursors, the recent US sovereigntist campaign against human rights, which aims to reassert American sovereignty on the global stage and protect it from global governance, goes back to the 70s, but it fired up from the 1990s as neoconservatives criticised the transformation of international law from a law of nations to a cosmopolitan law of human rights that sought to regulate the relation of states to their own citizens. Inspired by revisionist lawyers such as John Yoo and Eric Posner, who opposed the incorporation of international law into US law, the themes of this critique were those of globalism versus American values and popular sovereignty. Yet, even as its proponents railed against transnational bodies trumping democratic sovereignty, they defended free trade and free market economics and were no supporters of participatory democracy at home. Rather, against global governance and the belief that an American rights tradition had broken down into assertions of minority rights, US defenders of sovereignty sought to defend a Schmittian executive power and consolidate the pre-political foundations of the American political order, white supremacy, patriarchy, and Christianity. At first sight, such right-wing critiques of an unaccountable and undemocratic human rights bureaucracy that seeks to impose its priorities on populations seems to converge with arguments for democratic governance, self-determination, and even sovereignty that were crucial to anti-colonial struggles and to certain left-wing movements. Among these right-wing defenders of sovereignty in the United States, however, such arguments reappear in explicitly exclusionary and hierarchical forms. Take the outspoken defender of US sovereignty, John Font, director of the Center for American Common Culture at the conservative Rand Corporation spin-off, the Hudson Institute. On the surface, Font's contention that UN committees and human rights bureaucracies I quote, attempt to remove one policy issue after another from the give and take of democratic politics and place them all in the realm of universal human rights outside of democratic accountability and consent, mirrors many left-wing critiques of the depoliticizing function of human rights. Yet at every moment, Font's invocations of democracy and the need to protect it from undemocratic elites is undercut by his rejection of democratic interference with market forces. When Font criticizes those he terms global governances for intervening in civil society, commercial enterprise, and private life, in his words, in the name of substantive equality among ethnic, racial, and gender groups, it's apparent that his true aim is not to defend popular sovereignty or democracy, but to protect the freedoms of civil society from democratic and political challenge. Font rejects criticisms of the pre-political foundations of the United States, notably its racial and economic inequalities, which he argues, and I quote, result from millions of uncoerced individual choices in a free society. Font's backlash position ultimately amounts to counselling submission, not sovereignty, submission to the market, to inherited inequalities, and to the hierarchies of civil society. The cynicism and racial hierarchy that animates such right-wing critiques is clearest in the foreword to Font's book, written by the international editor of the conservative journal Quadrant, John O'Sullivan. There, O'Sullivan criticises unrepresentative transnational elites, along with politicians and bureaucrats, faceless diplomats, these are all quotes, lobbyists for NGOs, self-interested multinational corporations, professors, the UN, etc., for imposing on democratic polities who are powerless to challenge them. Again, on the surface, O'Sullivan's criticism of global governance as what he calls a massive, remote, undemocratic leviathan could be voiced by thinkers on the left. Yet O'Sullivan himself is a member of the neoliberal Mont Pelerin Society and was a special advisor to Margaret Thatcher. In 1977, along with the influential neoliberal development theorist Lord Peter Bower, O'Sullivan wrote a critique of the non-aligned movement's new international economic order and its demand for economic sovereignty. That article of Sullivan and Bower pitted itself against post-colonial sovereignty and appealed to Western liberal opinion to overcome its blindness to the violation of what the authors called human rights in the Third World, which they contended took forms as diverse as the massacre of wealthy minorities and the restrictions on the inflow of foreign capital. That these same figures reappear today as defenders of national sovereignty against the human rights campaigns of the global governance Leviathan tells us much about the neoliberal right's shifting relation to both sovereignty and human rights. Other sections of the organised neoliberal movement have made similar transitions. In his 2017 keynote address to the regional meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in Seoul, former Czech president and Mont Pelerin Society member Václav Klaus bemoaned the rise of ideologies of human rightism, as he called it, along with the power of NGOs and the accelerating shift to transnationalism and global governance. Stressing that to protect liberty, we need to defend the sovereign nation state, Klaus faulted human rightism for encouraging mass migration to Europe, arguing that it had sacrificed civil rights in favour of human rights, changed the concept of rights from negative to positive ones, and incorporated migration among human rights. Rehabilitating a strand of thinking that was prominent amongst early European neoliberals, Klaus depicted Europe as the home of traditional values, hard work, and the market economy, which was threatened by culturally unassimilable migrants who, he wrote, are not coming into Europe as a labour force, but as recipients of all kinds of benefits. National sovereignty from this perspective was not at odds with the market. Rather, it was necessary to protect the market from those who sought to transform it into, in his words, a social market economy with the emphasis on the social. Similar anxieties about the role of human rights in challenging market relations are also evident in the neoliberal critiques of human rights offered by Erich Posner and, prior to his conversion to a radically anti-liberal Catholicism, Adrian Vermeule. While Font is hysterical about the extent to which a global legal liberalism imposes itself upon American national sovereignty, and Klaus reiterates the founding Montpellier Society statement that the central values of civilization are in danger, Posner and Vermeule are deflationary about global liberal legalism, which they contend is a normative vision, not a descriptive hypothesis. Not only are there no penalties for violating human rights treaties, they argue, but there's little evidence that they lead to improvements in human rights in signatory countries. Moreover, far from enhancing liberal norms, globalization tends to empower executives as international relations call for speed, secrecy, and unity. As the United Nations has failed to prevent wars, they argue, global order ultimately rests on the executive power of the United States, which is essential to peace and prosperity. In his more recent criticisms of human rights hubris, Posner suggests that human rights advocates should follow the example of development economists who, when faced with similar failures, turned away from ideology and grand plans to abolish poverty towards small-scale empirical and contextual interventions. Expectations have been lowered in the development sector, he writes, and by extension, they also should be lowered in relation to human rights. Posner's critique of human rights therefore culminates in a technocratic post-political minimalism. Human rights may be the last utopia, but from such a perspective, they're still too utopian after all. Now, just before I conclude by looking briefly at the Biden administration, I've just realized that my computer is not plugged in, so just give me one moment before it turns itself off. Okay, sorry about that. So to finish, I just want to ask, are human rights back? And I want to make some brief remarks about Biden's election and what it's likely to mean, both for human rights and for their critique. Speaking at the launch of the US State Department's annual World Report on Human Rights at the end of March this year, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken announced this administration has placed human rights front and center in its foreign policy. Indeed, in its first 100 days, the Biden administration made some significant moves to abandon or reverse the Trump administration's attacks on human rights defenders and institutions. Notably, it moved to re-engage with the UN Human Rights Council, removed sanctions on the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, and disbanded Pompeo's Commission on Unalienable Rights. Although without naming it, Blinken explicitly repudiated the project of that commission, announcing that past unbalanced statements that suggest a hierarchy of rights, including, in his words, those offered by a recently disbanded State Department Advisory Committee, do not represent a guiding document for this administration. It's too early, obviously, to offer a full assessment of the shape of Biden's new human rights-centered foreign policy. So here I just want to limit myself to a few remarks about the features that seem to be discernible so far. First, over determining this policy and all the Biden administration's priorities is the new Cold War with China. Blinken singled out China in his speech, and the US human rights report he was launching accused China of both crimes against humanity and genocide in Xinjiang. Biden has also singled out Chinese abuses of human rights and America's self-appointed role in contesting them. In a briefing at the end of April, he told reporters that he had warned China's president, Xi Jinping, that no responsible American president can remain silent when basic human rights are violated. A president has to represent the essence of our country, he continued. America is an idea, unique in the world. We are all created equal. It's who we are. We cannot walk away from that principle. Just as the Trump administration sought to reframe human rights in order to use them as a weapon against China, One suspects that the human rights-centred nature of Biden's foreign policy is primarily an addendum to his conflict with China over economic superiority and global geopolitical dominance. This is so despite Blinken's explicit attempt to renounce the kind of selective Cold War human rights policy that is most clearly associated with the Reagan administration and Jean Kirkpatrick's infamous distinction between authoritarian allies and totalitarian adversaries. Contesting the view that the US should highlight abuse only in select countries and only in a way that directly advances our national interests, Blinken argued, standing up for human rights everywhere is in America's interests, and the Biden-Harris administration will stand against human rights abuses wherever they occur, regardless of whether the perpetrators are adversaries or partners. Nonetheless, it's already clear, despite the rhetoric, that Biden's human rights advocacy will be profoundly selective. Blinken's claim that one of the core principles of human rights is that they are universal rings hollow in the wake of Biden's professions of support for Israel's devastating bombardment of Gaza and his administration's repeated blocking of the UN Security Council's statement calling for an end to the latest round of the conflict. The affirmation that all people are entitled to these rights, no matter where they're born, what they believe, whom they love, or any other characteristic, again, that's Blinken, is tattered by the administration's decision to go ahead with the $23 billion arms sale to the United Arab Emirates, negotiated under Trump as a component of the Abraham Accords, despite that country's repeated war crimes in Yemen. All this is deeply familiar, and there's nothing particularly intellectually interesting about it. Such hypocrisy and selectivity have been key targets of human rights critics for decades, and in this respect, little distinguishes Biden's approach to that of previous human rights avowing US administrations. Also familiar is the return of personnel associated with the human rights establishment, scorned under Trump, to the centre of the US administration. Biden's nominee for Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour is Sarah Margon, currently Director of Foreign Policy Advocacy at the Open Society Foundations and former Washington Director of Human Rights Watch. Obama-era humanitarian interventionists have also made a return to the centre of US power, with Samantha Power to head US aid and Susan Rice heading the White House Domestic Policy Council. All this suggests a return to the pre-Trump status quo and the healing of the recent rift between the human rights establishment and the US administration. So too does the renewed commitment to women's rights and sexuality rights, which Pompeo's commission aimed to step away from. More interesting and less clear at this stage is how Biden's human rights foreign policy will relate to his domestic economic agenda. In his speech, Blinken contended that countries that respect human rights are, I quote, more likely to have growing economies and be markets for our own goods and services, while countries that run roughshod over the rights of their people are also those breaking trade rules. All this is a familiar rhetorical gesture to what I've called neoliberal human rights. That is, the belief that defending human rights and defending the market are mutually complementary, and that defending market freedom is a critical component of defending human rights. Yet, at least rhetorically, Biden has now disavowed central elements of the neoliberal consensus of the previous decades, declaring notably that trickle-down economics has never worked. Biden has emphatically asserted the return of big government, with spending plans that, if they were ever implemented, would dwarf FDR's New Deal. In this, he's late to the party. Variants of state capitalism are increasingly central to the world economy, notably but by no means exclusively in China. All this raises a number of questions. Is neoliberalism over again? And if so, what would that mean for human rights? And how will the US administration square what looks to be a familiar neoliberal human rights discourse in foreign policy with a turn away from the promotion of a liberalising economic agenda at home and potentially also abroad? Today, the certainties of an American-led end of history have largely crumbled, even as Biden's election has offered new hope to those nostalgic for liberal millenarianism. This situation brings new dangers, no doubt, and it has been easy for human rights advocates to fall back into familiar liberal poses, seeking their own legitimacy in the fear of possible alternatives, the state of nature, the gulag, fascism, populism. Yet for many of today's critics of human rights, a politics that relies on rights to protect us from the dangers of politics has in fact proven impotent in forestalling new dangers, if it has not in fact helped to foster them. The dangers of our present are real, yet refraining from critique makes sense only if we accept, with Ignatieff, that human rights are indeed the most we can hope for. For those who continue to believe that there is more to hope for and that another world is possible, the challenge is to go beyond abstract affirmations of possibility and to begin to conceptualize and construct those other worlds. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jessica. You pick up many of the themes of the whole symposium, so great to hear. Now, Elena, please, we leave the word to you for comment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jessica. Great presentation. And it is quite of a challenge to respond immediately after listening to you. Well, it's great, but there is obviously a risk that my comments are a little bit spontaneous and maybe more generous. General. I'm very sorry. As I
Feel
would
free
like
to be
them
generous.
to be, I would, but I mean, I would love to read and to think and anyhow, my interpretation of what you are contributing to with this particular project is a reflection whether it is possible to repoliticize human rights, to drive them into future as a politics as project for justice, political future rather than a political instrument. So I interpret you, and I appreciate very much your starting point with reflection about what is the purpose and responsibility of academic who is a critic of human rights, and your depiction of differences between different kind of critique. I appreciate very much, and I recognize a lot of these differences, and I agree with most of it. Maybe I agree with all of it, but then I need some more time to think through what you depicted. So absolutely, I agree with the need to highlight differences between ideologically different critique of human rights, and this is maybe most prominent within media sphere when you present all black and white, and when you very often experience that all critique would be the same. So, and then you get this human rights or against human rights. So there are no options. So I believe that your project is a little bit similar to what we've heard from Igor yesterday, that maybe it is rather a struggle about human rights rather than for or against human rights. But anyhow, I would like to maybe still have some questions to you or reflections. I agree then when you make this taxonomy or your depiction of different kind of critiques of human rights, you say that they have different objects of critique, and you have absolutely demonstrated that it is the case. I wonder, especially when speaking with you, who is also a historian, would you say that maybe we also need to be more cautious about who are subjects of human rights? So could it be the case that we often think of large agents, what it would, and who are large and why they are large. Wouldn't it be a good idea to also look into, for example, small, who would define what is small, domestic NGOs? For example, I'm familiar a little bit with the situation in Russia, and it is much more complex that we know of. So, but if we think of Russia, we think that either you are pro-Kreml or you are against, and this is the picture. But I would say that when I would be happy to see a professional historian to look into other subjectivity within human rights than US state, large international NGOs who are, we know, of special materialistic design. So this would be my first concern. And this is not a critique to what you do, but I just try to imagine whether our picture of this critique would be a little bit different. And this is, I guess, it is also relate a little bit to the idea of what academic critique of human rights is about. As I presented my position yesterday, I believe that academic, at least in our disciplines, is about critique. This is what we do. So we cannot do anything else. But when it relates to different political visions, I do not believe that academic can create visions. I do not believe in that. I believe that we can maybe highlight interesting political visions that are emerging. But still, I wonder sometimes whether academics who are left themselves in broad sense are a little bit too reactive rather than active. For example, I realized that I mentioned Ignatieff, Wendy Brown wrote to Ignatieff, you mentioned Ignatieff, and said, why on earth Ignatieff? You see, well, maybe this somehow maybe sometimes we are also answering to the dominant discourse somehow. Maybe it restrains us a little bit, and this is related to my concern about who are subject of human rights. To whom are we talking, and why are we talking to precisely? And I think, for example, well, Russia maybe too difficult, maybe too much of a Cold War and bad guys, but Islamic NGOs in Europe, they are censorship now. Even in Sweden, they are suppressed. The Swedish state is trying to suppress Islamic Muslims NGOs. Why not also looking at them? And when I would like to give you time to respond and other to pose questions. Maybe one more thing I would like to bring into our discussion today. I agree, as I already said, I agree very much with the importance to distinguish different kinds of criticism when it comes to human rights or other important things, peace or whatever. But at the same time, we have some points, and you mentioned some of them, that are very much ambivalent, when it is not as easy to say that this is something the guys from the right do, and this is something the left do. For example, sovereignty. For some years ago, I published an article on how anti-colonial rhetoric is used by Kremlin. And it is very, very ambivalent. It is not as easy at all that sovereignty is just an issue to let us do what we want. So here I believe it is also important to, and I believe that Habermas in several settings mentioned this, how he was trying to learn from conservatives. And I read him as not an attempt to react to conservative critique, but to reclaim some sufficient problems that are problems and need to be framed from different positions. So I would say that the issue of sovereignty and the right to define rights, among those issues that both left anti-colonial critique, anti-racism, and some voices that we would rightly describe as conservative and right, relate to some extent. They are similarities, so we need somehow to address. I will stop here, and thank you very much again. It was just wonderful listening to you.
Please go ahead, Jessica. Thanks, Elena.
Thank you so much. They're really fantastic comments and provocations. And I know from yesterday how difficult it is to have to do something on the spot as soon as someone finishes speaking. So thank you. In terms of my project, and you framed it as the attempt to repoliticize human rights. And I mean, I'm certainly, I'm sympathetic to those who are attempting to do that, but I think I wouldn't necessarily frame my own political position within the bounds of human rights. I don't necessarily see myself as fighting over what human rights should be, as much as I see myself as attempting to open up the possibility to think about other ways to conceptualize the good, to conceptualize human life together that doesn't have to frame itself in the language of human rights. But I don't think that was entirely clear in this paper, because in many ways what I was trying to do here much more was simply map some of the strands of human rights critique over the last few decades. And in particular, I mean, the motivation for this paper was a frustration with those figures like Alston, like Catherine Sickink, who want to close down all critique of human rights on the basis that this supposedly empowers authoritarian, evil right-wing leaders. And I think that this kind of gesture has been so central, not just to contemporary human rights, but to a liberalism founded on fear of the state of nature, a sort of a politics that has no positive justification other than the alternative to us is really scary and really bad. And I wanted to contest that and say it's not enough to say that people should refrain from critiquing human rights because there are some right-wing figures who we wouldn't like very much who also critique human rights. And so I wanted to disarticulate those different strands of human rights on the right and on the left. But I agree with you that there is a real ambivalence, and I tried to bring that out the way that certain criticisms that are now wielded from the right sound very much like criticisms from the left. And in some cases, this is about shifting historical periods, shifting political projects. So the particular project that sovereignty signified for anti-colonial leaders, and particularly for those who were defending economic sovereignty in the 1970s in the name of the new international economic order, was a particular project that was about restricting the power of multinational corporations. It was about the international redistribution of income. It was about compensation for colonial exploitation. And so that, in that context, was what was named by sovereignty. And the reason that I found this article or this foreword by John O'Sullivan that I mentioned so fascinating in defending sovereignty against submission was that this figure, who was a real critic of that post-colonial sovereignty, economic sovereignty project, can today be reinvented as a defender of sovereignty. And I think what strikes me is that many of these pro-sovereignty figures on the right, and particularly those who have come from within the neoliberal movement and made the sort of shift from so-called globalism to sovereignty, are nonetheless strong defenders still of the idea that market relations should be preserved from democratic challenge. And so when they say sovereignty, they don't actually mean challenges to private power or to the supposedly spontaneous order of the market. They're much more likely to mean border controls, particularly migration controls, but they're also much more likely to be talking about defending a kind of a national market regime against, say, the social demands of the European Union as they see them. So, yeah, I was trying to just pull out those strands in order to contest the idea that anyone who's worried about the rise of the right needs to just get back on board with the human rights NGOs and accept that human rights really are the most we can hope for. So that's the sort of the general, what spurned the paper, I guess, and then it developed into a much more sort of historical account of some of the different criticisms. So this question of the reactivity, I think is really interesting. The why do we bother with Michael Ignatieff? And yes, I've asked myself that, and I have a friend and colleague, Jeannie Moorfield, who spends a lot of time, she's written whole books on figures like Ignatieff, and she's often asked similar questions. And I think for better or for worse, these people are influential and they have power, and they also have been able to sort of to distill a dominant sensibility. I mean, in Ignatieff's case, I think he was really a central figure of the sort of humanitarian intervention moment and a significant figure in shutting down other forms of larger scale emancipatory politics and for defending this sort of moralized liberal interventionism and particularly military interventionism. And I think that that remains worthy of critique. In terms of the question of other subjects, this is something that I've thought about quite a lot. And on the one hand, I agree with you. And I think that it is important to look at subjects that are not the big, the US State Department, Human Rights Watch, etc., particularly in relation to human rights. And indeed, many people do. There's lots and lots of good work on the more sort of subaltern human rights work or more grassroots human rights work. But I'm particularly interested in the critiquing discourses of power. The fact remains that organisations like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International have an ability to set an agenda, have extraordinary budgets larger than the budgets of certain nation states. So my own interest is in the critique of these major human rights NGOs, because I think that and this critique is not just arbitrary. I think that those NGOs have been very central in moralizing neoliberalism in the period of its rise, and that while neoliberalism is easily cast on its own terms as a sort of cold, economically rational discourse, that the NGOs have provided the moral complement to this. And therefore, what they've been able to do is sell this package to many people who see themselves as progressive or on the left. So, I mean, this is my own personal interest. It doesn't mean that I think that those human rights NGOs or actors are the only ones that are meaningful. I think it does matter that people take up human rights for all kinds of diverse purposes. And I do try hard in my book to say that I'm not suggesting that everyone who uses the language of human rights is a neoliberal, or that all human rights discourses are necessarily neoliberal. I don't say that. But nonetheless, I think that the most powerful human rights NGOs have put forward an agenda that has been very complementary to that pushed by central neoliberal thinkers from the 40s, but in particular since the 70s. And yes, yeah, I mean, I think I've already sort of mentioned the question of ambivalence, but I mean, I think that's right. And I think that's what's so difficult about this period. Like, it's not obvious that there's a clear left and there's a clear right, and there are forms of critical discourse that circulate from one to the other. But I guess the sort of dividing line that I wanted to draw in this paper was between those who want to simply preserve the inequalities of civil society and those who believe that political intervention into civil society in the name of greater equality is legitimate. So I think I'll leave it there, but thank you very much for those comments, and I hope there's an opportunity for further discussion and engagement.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks, Elena.